Best and most blessed greetings of divine peace, grace, goodness, and divine light, dear beloved brothers and sisters. Welcome to Soul of Islam Radio. My name is Ihsan. I am a faith-based life coach with the goal of supporting seekers upon the path in finding a healthy balance between the spiritual and practical dimensions of life in the modern world. And my platform seeks to serve as a bridge between the worlds of matter and spirit, faith and the lack of it, the practical and the religious, the temporal and the eternal, the old and the new, and the body and mind and the heart. I recently had the opportunity to sit and engage in an illuminating conversation with Hajji David Sterling, author of Journey in Grace, Gems Gathered from a Life on the Path, which is an incredibly enjoyable autobiography of Brother Dawood's journey to Islam, his meetings with remarkable men and women of faith, and the deep and divine wisdom gained along the way. Hajji Dawood embraced Islam in 1976 in Monterey, California, as part of an early wave of converts or reverts to the faith. The son of Jewish Holocaust survivors, Sidi Dawood brings a unique perspective to his journey to Islam, and his book, Journey in Grace, is nothing short of a spectacular account of the constant divine mercy and light of God as it guides the sincere and seeking soul. In this episode, Hajji Dawood and I discuss what led him to Islam, his personal background and reasons for writing his book, the importance of meditation and mindfulness, and how they relate to the awakening of the heart, the purpose of the spiritual path, the gift of suffering, and much more. Without further ado, I invite you to join us in this conversation and journey from the mundane to the spiritual, from the temporal to the eternal, and from the common to the remarkable. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace, light, and blessings be with you, Soul of Islam Radio listeners, and with you, dear Hajji Mustafa, aka David Sterling. Welcome, Hajji Mustafa.
Thank you very much. Wa alaikum salam. It's a delight to be here with you.
It's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Now, you'll be fairly new to many of our listeners on Soul of Islam Radio. And so just as a brief introduction, you are the author of a book entitled Journey in Grace, Gems Gathered from a Life Upon the Path. And in your book, you have an incredible account of your spiritual journey throughout your life from a young age, and finding Islam ultimately, and embracing the path, and many amazing experiences along the way. But for people who are not familiar with your story, Hajji Mustafa, where does your story begin? What is the origin of your story?
Well, the origin of my story is the same as the origin of everybody's story. We all come from that one, and we return to that one, and we live by that one, and our life is predicated upon that one. But on a biographical level, on how it played out and how it plays out for me, is that I was born of Jewish Holocaust surviving parents. They came to the United States in 1946, and I lived in a community of refugees in New York. And it was a wonderful experience in that there was a sense of belonging, a sense of shared background, and a great deal of accountability and support for each other in a way of life, and especially in the new way of life. As that went on, although I felt connected to that group of people and that particular ethnic and cultural background, there was something in me which recognized and acknowledged that there was something greater, that there was a sense in me of a universality, that I belonged not only to the people I was with, but to the greater humanity, to the greater realities of life beyond just this one particular context. And that stayed with me as I grew older, as I grew into a teenager. I was constantly being kind of scolded by my parents that I wasn't sticking sort of to my own people, so to speak, that I was reaching out to others. I couldn't help that. There was something in me which drew me and made me kind of come out of the box that I was in. And part of that was not just curiosity, but a driving force within me. I can name it now and I can articulate it now, but when I was young, I could not. I know now what it is that it is that ruru and spirit that each one of us has that drives us to return to ourselves, to resonate to that light, to that beyond time and space reality within us. And it really drives how we move in life, what we're attracted to, what we were repulsed by. I know that now, but then I couldn't pinpoint it like I and explain it like I am now. So that was the driving force. So when I became now a teenager and became older, I started to interact with people, and especially I grew up in the 1960s. So I was a child of the 60s. There was the hippie movement, the anti-war movement. There was an effulgence of spiritual teachers that were coming, especially in the 70s, also from Turkey, from India, from all over the world. And I felt like drawn into that whole wave and taken up by that whole wave. I can't even claim that it was something that I did, but yet it was more like I became in the process or destined to be in that process of unfoldment. So it took me to meet people who normally as I grew up in the certain context that I did, would probably never meet. But that's something that light, that magnetic reality within me drew me. So I started meeting people, like I said in my book, people like Baba Frijan, like Swami Muktananda, like Krishnamurti, people of that caliber, just meeting them out of not necessarily seeking them, but just coming along, and all of a sudden, I met them and I was drawn into it. Everything that happened, that's why I named my book Journey in Grace, because I was not the doer in it. And it was more like drawn into it and gifted at every moment, at every experience in that new wave that was happening, and the new sort of evolutionary process that was going on inside me. So when I became older, and more experienced with these exposures, I started to still have a sense of this is not it yet. I'm just now smelling the flowers, so to speak. I'm tasting it a little bit, but I didn't see a holisticness in it. I didn't see a completeness in the exposures that I had. And it really wasn't until I met a group of Sufis, again in a very extraordinary circumstance, that I was drawn into that, and I felt for the first time a natural belonging to it, as though it was a way that just encompassed me in a more complete way, intellectually, emotionally, physically, just observing behavior and energy between people. It was a complete new opening for me. So in about I actually embraced Islam in about 1970, 76 or early 77 in California, in Monterey, with the group that came from England, mostly Sheikh Abdul Qadir, a Sufi, and his group there.
Wow, so that's quite a long time ago, and quite an adventure, quite a journey. I mean, a lot of the people, especially in that era, found themselves flocking to Eastern spirituality. Some of the teachers you mentioned, as well as others, but typically within the Zen or the Buddhist or the Hindu or the yogic traditions. And you experienced that, but you felt that there was something that was still perhaps lacking, something more, something that might have be described as you described it, as more whole, more complete. And And also, I think, given maybe perhaps possibly due to the fact that you come from a Jewish background, a monotheistic tradition, what was it qualitatively that settled in your heart, if you might be able to describe that, that was different with, let's say, the path of Islam and the experience with the Sufis?
In a way, when I came in touch, as you quite rightly point out here, when I came in touch with the Sufis, with Muslim Sufis, in this case in particular, there was a familiarity of it. Now, that familiarity did come in some way as a result of my background in the, as you mentioned, the monotheistic background. Yes, I think that is part of it. But I think really overall that each that I was only one of maybe three or four people in the Jewish background that I knew at that time that embraced Islam and came to the path of Sufism. There were many, of course, others. So I really, ultimately, what I experienced was that we're all the same in that way. That if each of us has a soul, a ruh, a spirit in us that is driving the narrative, that is driving us to seek and driving us to find, and is connected in every way seamlessly to Al-Hadi, the guide who guides us and brings us to meet the things that's necessary for that soul to find its expression. So I think more than anything, it is that, and that's why I named my book Journey in Grace. Again, it is, I find that in every circumstance of my life and of everything I've ever observed with any of my friends and people and associates, that the biggest openings, the most connections that people have made with realities, higher consciousness, etc., were through grace. Maybe they made some effort this way or that way. Maybe I did, find myself in that circumstance, but that made it possible for me to recognize that this was the right path for me. But it came from a compulsion, like a moth to a flame. I can't articulate the path that, I did this and I did that, and and then that is very superficial in a way. It is little steps that I took. It reminds me now all of a sudden that if you take, it says in a great tradition that we have, if you take one step towards Allah, Allah takes 10 towards you. It's already in process. It's happening. I just had to make myself available to it, accept it, and not reject it. I didn't create it. It came about, and I had to accept it. And that recognition came from from an inner center, magnetic center, you can say, within me. That when it came to that outer mirroring of that reality, which is an inner reality, then I accepted it and embraced it. And when I did, I saw the truth of it to my limited mind and consciousness. I recognized it and embraced it. I liken it, when I first said my shahada, like a camera coming into focus. I kind of knew the whole picture, but it was blurry. But when I embraced Islam and took the shahada and started to imbibe the shahada, I mean, the shahada, as you know, saying Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, is just the beginning. It's not as you know, it's not an end of anything. It's, in fact, when you say something like that, it's almost a lie. Because do I really witness Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah? Do I really encompass and imbibe Muhammadan Rasulullah? It is, a beginning, and one has to, what I found, accept and continue to accept and imbibe whatever one has the capacity to imbibe of that path.
MashaAllah. So what you're describing, Hajji Mustafa, really is, I guess, what maybe we can call guidance from the heart or through the heart. And my shuyukh have often referred to tasawwuf specifically as the way of the heart. We have a rich tradition in which the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings upon him and upon all the messengers of God, he says that there's a piece of flesh in the body of the human being that if it is good, everything will be good. Their actions, their guidance, everything will flow well. And if it is bad or if it is corrupted, then they'll be compromised. And that is the heart. What would you say in terms of now your years, your decades on the path, on the spiritual path, with regards to the importance of the heart for those who are seeking truth, who are seeking light, who are seeking guidance, who are seeking God?
Well, it's all about the heart. There's nothing other than the heart. The heart is the place in where you have the capacity, the possibility of unveiling that which is already within you. The heart there's a place that the Prophet Muhammad called Beit Allah, and there's only two places that Beit Allah is applied to. One is the Kaaba, and one is the heart. He says in a Hadith Qudsi that the whole world and the whole universe cannot contain me, but the heart of the mu'min contains me. That we know that within every human being there is a soul of ruh bil amri rabbi. Allah says that, and as you know, in the Quran, they said when they ask you about the soul, say ruh bil amri rabbi. It's by the order of Allah, and that order resides within the core of our being. The heart is the seat and core of our being, and it is pure. It is a representative of timelessness. It is an access that we have to the reality, to the absolute that is always resident within us. Yet at the same time, as you know, we have that reality was within us. We have the ephemeral and conditional self, which is we refer to, as you know, as the nafs, as the self, as the self-architecture, which develops as a result of that ruh within us, because the ruh drives everything, the construction of the self, the body, and the perception of all of the universe. But as a conditioned being, as you and I grow up, as identified with our life, who we are, with our names, what people have called us, our traditions, and so on. This, as you know, builds the architecture of the ephemeral or conditioned self. So everything there is now the dynamic to take place for transformation. So you have these two zones: the zone of the absolute, which is present but unknowable by the mind, but yet present. And present is very important to evoke here, because it is the only presence that in existence is Allah Azza wa Jal, is the light of God, the presence of this, which is represented in the Ruh spirit that resides within us. That is one zone. The other zone, in the heart, so to speak, is the self structure, and that is a limited and conditioned situation. So everything that we need to sort of evolve is taking place within the core of our being, within our heart. It is not, I mean, we can address it, some emotional element in it. There's a lot about love in relationships, but that is another kind of love. The kind of love that is resident within the heart, in my perception, is the ultimate connectivity. Love is connectivity, connecting the front with the ruh and the self, and that architecture of the self, so that the more it connects, the more we focus and imbibe and resonate with the heart, the soul within us, it then has an alchemical and dynamic transformational effect on the self-structure, because the self-structure only is binary. It reacts to what it's good for it and bad for it, and that depends on our conditioning. But if it relates to something which is higher, which engulfs and has all the Asma Husna, the names, the Sifat of Allah within you, then that resonating with that transforms the self-structure, and it starts to become more and more transparent. What we're getting at here is, to answer your question, is that it is all about the heart. Everything takes place within the heart. That's why the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that if that is bad, that means it's completely suffocated by the self and the architecture of the self. then what is the use of that? It's bad. But if it's good, meaning it is submitted, it is in Islam, it is a Muslim nafs, so to speak. And I mean that beyond just the reference to the religious affiliation to being a Muslim. This happens to universally to all humankind. All humankind has the potential for this. All humankind experiences this. You ask anyone outside of, so to speak, Islam, there are so many people who experience this and sense the presence of the one within them. The great gift of being a Muslim is that we have the perfect model and the perfect sort of blueprint and mapping to this transformative life. And so everything we do within Islam is not ritualistic. It is transformative if you get deeply into the meaning of every act and so on, and it applies to this heartful transformation. Once you become aware of that, at least I understand this for my own self, that once I became aware of this two zones and this sort of mapping within me, then everything started to make sense around me. And then it happened really only many decades after becoming a Muslim. I was fumbling around, I was acting in a transactional way with God. I do this so many prayers and I'll get so many good, rewards in the garden and this and that. It was, or culturally, I interacted with Muslims around me and yes, I'm a Muslim with you, brother, and so on. And that's fine. It was in a sort of a tribal sort of affiliation and there was goodness in it. But ultimately, I started seeing people who are Muslim, including myself. Why am I not yet happy? Why am I still discontent? Why am I anxious? Why am I worrying about the what I did in the past and regrets? Why am I still projecting into the future? This is that has to be addressed as a Muslim. As a Muslim, I had to address that. I had to address, what does it mean to be in dhikr of Allah? What does it mean to fi salatihim daiman? You're in a state of submission, of that prayer all the time. You're in sajda all the time. What does that mean? So in essence, it is all about the heart. There is nothing outside of it except if one believes and goes through life thinking and interacting with life outside of this sort of a mapping, it's all mostly a waste.
I like how simplified you express that, in the sense that it's all about the heart, which is actually something that Allah Almighty says in the Quran himself, that at the end, nothing will avail a human being except for a sound, whole heart, qalbun salim. And a lot of times the spiritual aspect, the spiritual dimension of Islam, often referred to as Sufism, Tasawwuf, Tazkiyah, other titles or names as well. It's the spiritual, the way that I would describe it, as the spiritual dimension, the inner dimension of the religion, which constitutes its rituals, its forms. This would be the essence of the religion, what the forms are meant to protect. What would you say, Hajji Mustafa, is the purpose of the path, which also, in a sense, I could say, similarly, is the same question. What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of religion?
It's simple. It's so simple. This age-old question, what is the purpose? It really is simple. As you know, reality says, in the Quran, that he did not create man or jinn, but to worship me, he said. That, وَلَا خَلَقْنَا جِنِّي وَإِنسِي إِلَّا يَعْبُدُونَ. He said, and so what does that mean? What is worship? Worship means that you come into a state of presence and acknowledgement of the reality that is within you and is also beyond you. It is a complete connectivity to that reality. So we live our life from that perspective, that we want to become, we want to cut through all of our sort of ephemeral and issues. Allah says in the Quran also that kullu man bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, kullu man alayha fan, wa yabka wajhu rabbika dhul jalali wal ikram. Everything is vanishing except the face of Allah. Everything is in in flux and in moving away and in entropy, except that one reality. So if you wake up and you start to realize this in one's life, that everything is moving, well, asr, inna insan lafi khusr, ban is in a decline, except for those who have that iman. So you begin, if Allah gives you the gift to begin to suffer, that's one of my teachers, whenever people came to him and said, Sheikh, what is the meaning of life? Why can't I touch the ultimate and become more spiritual? He used to just outright say, suffer. Well, why? Why suffer? Well, you have to suffer. Suffering is a result of distraction, of ghafala, of not acknowledging and tasting and experiencing and resonating with the light which is beyond time and space. So we have to suffer, so we discriminate, that if we can, and this is a gift that happens to human beings, all of us, but particularly people who then begin to acknowledge that there's a path, that if you go this way you're burned, and this way you're enlightened, you're delighted. It's a discriminating and alchemical sort of element in our life. So this is what each one of us has, and that suffering then guides us into finding the path and finding the truth. And ultimately, the meaning of life is for that, is to discover what is already within you. It is not something that you acquire. You can't gain God. You can't gain enlightenment. You have it already within you. So it is a process to discover, uncover, unveil. And that is a process of living your life with that view, so that it sharpens your perception, your inner ability to acknowledge and recognize what is ghafala, what is forgetfulness, and that which is forever and present within you. And then it becomes part of your life. You taste it. It's so interesting about this issue of the two zones. One is the absolute zone of Allah Azza wa Jal, beyond time, beyond space. His Dhat is also, maybe it was used that way. And the other is the ephemeral and the transitory, and so on. But we've been given sensory ability, like the khayal, the wahima. These are the ability to imagine, to project meaning. These are not just small, subjective little gifts. It gives us like a sense of what is the absolute. Like an example is, if you see a flower, you see it, but then when you smell it, then you know so much more about it. It communicates something greater about the flower that you didn't know just by eyes and touch. It's the same way with God, with the absolute one within us. Is that there are elements, like God gave us these rungs on a ladder to put our feet on, to stand on, and sense that absolute. And like smelling the flower, we know that there's something beyond this world. There's something beyond just this person here is talking, and yet, it's and that gives us a greater sense of certainty and a source of happiness, because nothing else gives us that. Everything we know is vanishing, but when we taste that and we develop a taste for it, and we follow that taste, then I think we're on the path to discovering the purpose of life.
MashaAllah. Earlier, you quoted the Hajji Mustafa. You quoted the Hadith Qudsi, which, if anybody's not aware, is a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he is relaying what Allah has said. And this is, of course, not the Quran, but it is also revelation from Allah through the Prophet. And he said that neither the heavens nor the earth can contain me except the heart of the believer, qalbul mu'min. And so we have the house of Allah, which is the Kaaba, the Baytullah, but the people of knowledge have often pointed out that the true house of Allah is the human heart, the human heart that has been made empty of attachments, empty of vanity, empty of ego, and so a place in which the light of Allah can manifest and inhabit. On your journey, you met many people, remarkable people, and in fact, and I think your work has been compared to Gurdjieff's story, meetings with remarkable men, meetings with these servants of Allah who had emptied themselves of everything other than the love of God. Can you share with us maybe perhaps a story or two about some of these remarkable men that you met along the way upon your journey and on the path, who were living inheritors perhaps of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who were men of tremendous spiritual depth?
Yes. Actually, what comes to mind is a story about a wonderful, a woman. Her name was Shakura. In my book, I refer to her as Lady Shakura. She was a scholarly person, a Sufi. She came to Islam in about the same time that I had in the 1970s. And one thing that happened in her past life was that her father was working on the nuclear program in the Oppenheimer group in the 1940s. And in those days, they didn't know too much about radiation. So when they would set off an atomic explosion, her father would take her out to the desert in Nevada, a mile or two away, and they would observe it. Now, little did he know that he was exposing himself and his children to high levels of radiation. And eventually that radiation caused her to have cancer. Her brother, her father, her mother, so a lot of members in her family, extended members of her family. But I want to I put that there. You'll see how it relates to my story as I tell it. In the 1980s, I was selling books, spiritual books, books on Islam and Sufism, and I was attending a big meeting. I think it was an ICNA or ISNA, one of those big organizations. And as I was sitting there at my booth, there was a man who kept pacing back and forth in front of my booth, agitated. And I found it very remarkable that he just kept walking back and forth. And I knew I had to connect with him in some way. And he came up to me and he said, he said, I see you, that maybe you can give me some advice. And I said, well, sit down. And he turned out to be a man from Iraq. He had migrated to the United States. And he began to tell me a story in which he was telling me that he gave up his Islam after so many years of being in America. And he and his wife got involved in some unsavory situations, like swinging groups. And I mean, the complete sort of devolution of who they were. But then he said, but now I became a Muslim again. I've returned to Islam, and I want to change my life and hopefully to help my wife change, because I feel attached to her and I still love her. And he told me stories how she at home would laugh at him and criticize him for praying and for doing all the things that a Muslim would do in his behavior. And she wanted to continue with her life in debauchery. And he asked me, well, what do I think? I said, well, I think you should maybe, you've tried your best. You should let her go and just, Allah will give you a partner more fitting and for your evolution and so on. So I asked him, well, how did this transformation take place? And then he began to tell me the story. He said that one day he was in a hospital and there for a checkup. He wasn't Muslim or anything anymore at all. And over the speaker system, they had a call for anybody who can read Arabic and who could recite the Quran. And he said, well, okay. He said, I can read Arabic and recite the Quran. Now, he hadn't recited the Quran in many decades already and wasn't interested in Islam whatsoever at that time. So but he reported to the nurse that he was such, and they brought him to a room. And in that room, there was a woman lying in bed in the last moments of her life. And there were doctors standing around, a few nurses, a few family members. And he was handed a Quran, and he sat down, and the woman struggled to speak and said, could you recite Surah Al-Yasin for me? And I want to hear it in the last few moments of my life. So he turned to Surah Yasin in the Quran, and he started to read the Quran, Surah Yasin. He told me that as he started reading, he saw on the face of this woman like a golden light appear on her. And all the doctors and the nurses in the room and the family members were in awe of that moment. There was, he said, as though there was no roof in that room any longer. It was as though the sky had opened up above them, and that they were standing in the sunlight of this celestial light. And he started to read the Quran. And as he finished Surah Yasin, the lady took her last few breaths with the Shahada on her lips. He was so moved by that. And yeah, that he wept, he said, for hours. And he said he saw his whole life flash in front of him. And he made a vow that he would return to the deen, and that he would eventually become a hafiz of the Quran, which is, as you know, to memorize the entire Quran. He tells me this story, and I asked him, I said, well, who is the name of the person? And he said it was Shakura. And he told me, I forgot the last name now, but that's the person that I had known now for at least 15 years, 20 years. I knew her, and she was in the same madrasa that I studied in studying Islam in the Deen. She was there, and she became a good friend to my family. Now, how that connection was made, because I hadn't seen her for so many years, yet here is this man standing in front of me, had become completely transformed, had memorized the Quran in 2 years, and was telling me a story about somebody who I knew and was close to for so many years. This was, again, how can you orchestrate such a thing, to make such a thing? It is, again, a story of grace. Do I have time to say one more story?
Yes, please.
So another story which exemplifies clearly this grace that is constantly available is that I was in Pakistan living there, and I had been living under the instruction and companionship of a Chishti sheikh. His name was Sheikh Sayyid Ikram Hussain. He was from Hyderabad in Pakistan. And I was there with my wife at that time, and my wife was suffering from a bleeding disorder, a hormonal disorder, where she was bleeding a lot and becoming anemic. And this sheikh happened to be a hakim, which is, as you know, he practiced the medicine of the Prophet and also Greek-based medicine. It's called Tibba Yunani and Tibba Nebawi. And he said, you should find 10 grams of berberis and 10 grams of ifyun, which is opium. Now, I'm in Pakistan, and for me, let alone a Pakistani, but for an American looking for opium in Pakistan is not a very, the prospect for me would be very dire if I was caught, especially by the officials. I explained that to the sheikh, and he said, no, he said, these are the things, and Allah will guide you. So go. So he sent me out to look for it. So I went to this was now the next day. I went to a marketplace around a mosque. I can't remember the actual name of the district that I was in right now. I think it was called Karaja. But anyway, it was a mosque surrounded by lots of shops, and there was an area, souk, kind of bazaar in the back, which people were known to have very strange things available in that place. So I went there looking for Berberis was easy to find. I went to the pharmacologists, herbalists, found the Berberis. But opium, they said they actually chased me away. Said, "Don't ask us for opium. Go away. Opium is illegal. You can't find it." So I became very. At the end of the day, it was now becoming sunset, becoming Maghrib, and I had to return. So I started leaving the bazaar, and as I left, um, as I describe in my book, I'm standing there looking for a transport to get maybe a taxi or a tonga or horse-driven carriage or something. And then I felt a tug at my sleeve. And when I looked down, I at first assumed that it was a beggar, but then I saw this beautiful elderly man sitting on a white cloth. And he looked at me with a beautiful smile, and he had what's called in Pakistan a chistitopia, a hat which represented his lineage of connectivity to a Sufi tariqa. So he said, "Please sit down." So I sat down with him, and he said, "I need to tell you a story. I need to tell you something." And so I sat and listened to him in the atmosphere of this bazaar and people coming and going. But just we were in this little bubble of solitude and peace and silence. And he says to me, "Last night," he said, "and now that I had a dream," he said, "of my sheikh who came to me and said that I should come to this place and sit here and wait for an unusual person, an unusual moment." And he said, "And you will meet the service that is required of you." So I was really taken aback, and he said, "You are that person," he says to me. So I was very touched, and I didn't have any anticipation of what was coming next. He then brings he had a black bag, a leather bag that he was on his side. He brought it forward, and it's a typical sort of hakim bag. So he explained to me that he was a hakim, and he opened up his bag. And he said, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "I'm looking for 10 grams of afyun, of opium." And he reached in his bag and he pulled out a plastic bag with a black tar material in it. And I recognized what it was. It was opium. And he pulled out one of those little balance scales, and he put the gram weight on one side and the opium on the other. And it turned out to be exactly 10 grams of opium, exactly what I was looking for. And I explained to him all that I've explained now just to about what's happening with my wife and the prescription from another hakim, the sheikh, the Chisti sheikh. And he hands it to me. And in my foolishness, I started to try to pay him for it. But it was a really it wasn't insulting, but I was insulting myself to just try to hand him this money. But he said, "No." He said, "This is by God's grace." And we stood up together. He put his scale away, stood up, and we've embraced. And after we embraced, I said, "I need to leave here and bring this to my wife." Anyway, in a few moments, I don't know what happened. I was distracted by looking for a transport, but he was gone. And I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he came from, how to contact him. And I really had to do a kind of a reality check. I looked and I actually had the opium in my hand. So I went home and brought the opium, and I mixed it with the berberis and lemon, which was part of the prescription. And he asked me to make it the size of each pill, to roll them into pills and make them the size of a garbanzo bean. So I did that, and I started dosing my wife with this, and within 24 hours, her bleeding stopped, and she was feeling much better. But she was very intoxicated by ingesting the opium. It was one of my concerns about it, but a day later, the Sheikh Sayyid Ikram Hussein came to my home and saw her in that state of intoxication. glad that she had stopped bleeding. But then he asked me to show him the size of the pills that I was giving her. And he laughed at me and he just looked at me. He said, "Too big," right? And in my mind, the garbanzo was an American garbanzo size bean, but in Pakistan, in other places, they're actually quite tiny, dried. So he split the one I had made into four. So this is, again, another story of grace, of trust. And this is why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I wanted to share essentially with other people that we are all living a life of grace. That what happens in our life, maybe my stories are super, they're fantastic and they're dramatic and maybe a little bit odd and this and that, but all of us are the same in that way. We have circumstances, gifts along the way, encouragements, manifestation of guidance, of Allah's light and His grace in all of our lives. And we need to take a second look at the signs along our way of life. This is what happened it has happened and is happening still in my life. It is the carpet of mercy unfolding as I walk, and every human being has the same. We're all the same. Each one of us is the same. It's just a matter of recognizing, waking up, not being distracted by the regrets of the past or projections into the future, but being in the moment, being present. And if you're present, then you can read Iqra, you can read the moment. And that moment is reflected out from your heart, mirroring in the world around you and speaking to you and unveiling to you what you need to know at the time you need to know it. That you get the message if you're present and experiencing the moment and not distracted by this polarity of past and future and your own minutiae of thought to cutting through. And then that's what becomes possible is a life of grace and joy and astonishment also to the mystery of how Allah works, how the reality works. We can never know and contain that, understand that mystery, but it is what is happening at every single moment.
I would highly encourage everybody to get a hold of your book, Hajji Mustafa, an incredible story and journey from the self ultimately to God, which is a beautiful tale filled with all kinds of incredible experiences and encounters. I wish we had enough time to go into more and more of these stories, but we'd be here. There's no limit. There's no end to it. I want to thank you, Hajji Mustafa, for your time and for joining us today. How can people find your book and your page and how can they connect with you?
They can connect with the book is on Amazon. If you look up Journey in Grace, Gathered Gems from a Life on a Path, you'll find it there. And if you want to connect or write to me personally, I have a YouTube channel, which I think maybe you can make available. This is edited, and also I don't mind giving my email address and so on for people to want to connect and share with me their stories and so on.
So we'll include that in the description and the notes that accompany this recording. Maybe a last question, Hajji Mustafa. I mean, what was your hope? What was your primary goal in writing this book?
Really, it's the primary goal was what I described just now, but also it comes from an essential goal. And it just now kind of came to me. And there's the first ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika al-Kitabu la rayba fihi hudan lil-muttaqin, alladhina yu'minuna bil-ghayb wa yuqimuna as-salat wa mimma razzaqnahum yunfikun. That the end of that ayah is from the description of that ayah is what is the picture of the Muslim, the one who believes in that book which is beyond time and space. That book It doesn't say this book, it says that book. It gives it a sense of non-time, non-space, not something that can be corrupted, something which is uncorruptible. And that we establish the prayer, and we have tawakkul and taqwa and all that, and one can look at that. But the end of it is warazaknahum yunfikun, and what we give you, Allah speaking in the royal sense of the whole universal effulgence, what we give you, you give out. You become a conduit of what we've given you. So ultimately, I felt when I heard this ayah, and when I hear it now in my heart, that it is a part of a personal and universal fulfillment to share with other people. Yet that Allah has made this creation with all the signs within it, with all the gifts within it, with all the potential and possibilities within it. So as a human being the Khalifa of Allah, in order to fulfill your life fully, you have to be that too. You have to be the conduit of what you've been given, that which is not yours, the wisdom, and if you have any knowledge, if you have any from that reality, light, if you have it from that reality, to become a conduit for it and share it with other people. What we've given you, you give out. So in a way, for me, it's been in part a personal fulfillment and of that picture, that directive of how to be a living a Muslim, practicing, imbibing, and at the same time giving out, and remembering that it's not from you, because Allah said, from what we have given you, all these experiences are by His grace. All that we've talked about is by His grace, and if you can share it with other people, then you are fulfilling the echo of Allah's fadl, overflowingness, and His generosity. You become a conduit of that.
MashaAllah.
That's it.
Beautiful. That's beautifully said, Hajji Mustafa. And I love the themes and the topics that you mentioned in relation to that, specifically Khilafah, the vicegerency, deputyship of Allah. Beloved Soul of Islam Radio listeners, I highly encourage you to get Hajji Mustafa's book, David Sterling's book, Journey in Grace. It's a tale of receiving grace, and something that he's now, by the guidance of and the grace of Allah, seeking to transmit as well, receiving and transmitting grace. Thank you, Hajji Mustafa. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. What a delight to be with you. It is a really big gift to me. Thank you.
I pray that you enjoyed and benefited from this discussion and episode of Soul of Islam Radio. To help us continue to bring you these meaningful conversations regarding spiritual development, faith, and religion, do us a favor and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to be listening to this broadcast. And if you can think of at least one person who may benefit from this content, please share Soul of Islam Radio with them. To learn more about Hajji Dawood Sterling, I recommend a copy of his wonderful book, Journey in Grace, available wherever books are sold. For those who would like to reach out, we'll have a link to his current contact information in the show notes below this episode. To further connect with me and to learn how you can deepen your personal spiritual path and journey, please visit us at soulofislamradio.com and join our community through one of the many resources available there for your learning, growth, development, and awakening. With the will and grace of God, I look forward to connecting with you soon to your divine and eternal success.